We continue now at the top of Daf Bava Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 106a. On the previous summit, the Mishnah said that if there is a regional disaster, the tenant farmer is able to deduct from the amount of produce that he was going to supply to the owner. And the Gemara now says, what if the fields that were surrounding the tenant farmer's field, what if they didn't produce the same kind of produce? They produced fodder, which is for animals. What would be the halacha there? Rashi explains, on the one hand, we could say the four fields that surround his field, they were not windswept, and therefore it's not considered a regional disaster. Odilmer, maybe he can say to him, if these were planted with the grain, if it wasn't fodder, these also would have been windswept, and therefore it is, in fact, a regional disaster. And the Gemara continues along the same lines, what if it was a different kind of seed, something else in the surrounding fields? Rashi explains, if you're going to say that the aspasta, meaning the fodder, is not considered a separation, because we say, yes, it's true that the fodder, it was not windswept, but that wasn't included in the regional disaster. If it would have been the same kind of produce, so it would have been part of the disaster. If you can say again by the fodder that had it been a field of grain, it would have been windswept. But what would you say if it was different kinds of seeds? Meaning, if it was not fodder, but if it was just a different kind of produce, would you say the same thing? And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Let's say it's wheat with regards to barley. One field is wheat, the other is barley. Is that kezera acher dami? Is that considered like a different zera? Or maybe wheat and barley are close enough that that's essentially the same thing. And the Gemara continues and asks, Kol ha'olam kulo b'sheidafon, what if the entire world is windswept, v'shalo b'yerakon, but his field, it has a different issue, it's yerakon, meaning to say it's affected by mildew, inami, or kol ha'olam kulo b'yerakon, the other way around, the whole world is yerakon, v'shalo b'sheidafon, and he's shidafon. What would be the halach over there? Again, would that all be part of the regional disaster? And the Gemara says to all of these questions, take what the Gemara leaves it as a question. And the Gemara continues, Amar le zarachite, if the owner said to the tenant farmer, plant it with wheat, v'yazalhu v'zarasarin, he went ahead and he planted barley. V'ishtadov ruba debaga, and then the majority of the fields in this valley, they were windswept. V'ishtadov nami hanach sari delay, and also his field with barley, that was also windswept. So again, can he claim that's part of the regional disaster? What's the halacha? Mi amrinan damar le ilu zarata chite havenami mishtad. For do we say that he can say to him, if I had planted it with wheat, the same thing would have happened, it would have been windswept. O dilmor, maybe motzi amar le, he can say to him, ilu zarata chite, had you planted wheat like I instructed, have a mekayim be, so then the pasuk would have been fulfilled with me. The pasuk says, "Vatigzar Omer v'yakam lach," you will decree something and it will be fulfilled. Meaning to say, if you would have done what I told you to do, so then the pasuk would have been fulfilled. That which I said would have been successful. And the Gemara says to that, Mistabrim makes sense to say, Diomar le, that he can say to him, Izarat achite have a mekayim bi vatigzar Omer v'yakam lach. He could say that had you planted wheat, so the pasuk would have been fulfilled, which said that he decrees something and it's fulfilled. V'yal derechecha nagaor, and on your ways the light will shine. And the Gemara continues, Nishtadfu kol sados of shalmachkir. Let's say all of the fields of the owner, all of his fields are windswept. V'ishtadov nami habahadayu, and this one also, which the tenant farmer is taking care of, this also is windswept. V'lo ishtadov ruba debaga, but the majority of the fields that are in this valley, they're not windswept. What's the halach? In that case, mi amrinan, do we say, kevan de lo ishtadov ruba debaga, since the majority of the fields in the valley were not windswept, lo menachile, so he's not able to deduct, it's not considered a regional disaster. Odilmor, maybe kevan de shtadov kulo arate, since all of this owners, all of his lands were windswept, Matzi Amar le, so we can say to him, Hai mishum lesach didachu, the reason why this field was windswept is because of your bad fortune, ta mishtadfu kol sadasecha, because all of your fields were windswept. And the Gemara says, Mistabra makes sense to say, the Yamar Le, that he can say to him, Imishum lesoy didi, if it was really because of me, have a mishtayr li porsa, a small amount at least would have been left for me. Kedechsiv, as is written in the pasuk, Ki nisharnu ma'at meharbe, we had a little bit remaining, and so therefore the owner can claim that this field that the tenant farmer was taking care of was not necessarily part of the gezerah against him. And the Gemara continues along the same lines, Nishtadfu kol sados of shel chocher, let's say all the fields of the tenant farmer, let's say they were all windswept, Vishtadav ruba de baga, and the majority of the fields in the valley, they were also windswept. Vishtadav nami habadayu, and this one was windswept along with them. What would be the halacha in that case? Mi amrinan keven dishtadav ruba de baga. Do we say that since the majority of the fields of the valley, they were windswept, menachile, therefore you can deduct it's like a regional disaster? Or dilmor, maybe keven dishtadav kulo arate, since all of this person's property was windswept, Matzi amarle, he can say to misham lesach didachu, it's because of your bad fortune. Because all of your fields were windswept. And the Gemara answers to that, Mistabra da'amarle, it makes sense that he can say to him, Misham lesachu, that it is your bad fortune. But the Gemara says, Amai, why do we say that it's because of the tenant farmer's bad fortune? Hachanami, why don't we say over here also what we said above? Neimolei, let him say to him, Misham lesa didihu, if it's because of my bad fortune, have him meshayerli porsa. Again, a small amount would have remained for me to have a mekayim be kinisharnu me'art meharbe, because it would have been fulfilled, the pasuk of kinisharnu me'art meharbe, as we said above. And the Gemara says to that, we don't apply that to the tenant farmer. Misham da'amar le, it's because he can say back to him, Mihave chazis l'shtayure lachmidi, if it was true that something of yours should have remained, have a mishtayur lachmida nafshach, what would have remained would have been your own property, not just property that you were managing. And Rashi explains, V'sig zaromer, again, the owner can say that what he decrees is fulfilled. Masha tevakish min hayotzer yasa, meaning what I request from the Creator, that is done. Vanilo bikashti min hashamayim betchilas hashana sheyatzlichene b'saorim. I didn't ask at the beginning of the year min hashamayim. I didn't ask from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be successful with barley. Ela b'chitan. I asked about wheat, and therefore he can say it's the fact that the tenant farmer planted barley. That's why it was not successful. And we'll take a look at Tosas as well. Again, the owner can say to the tenant farmer, Haves chazis lishtayure lach. If you would have been fit that something should have remained for you, this is talking about the case where all of the tenant farmer's property, it was all windswept. So he can say to him, if that was true, that something should have remained, have a mishtayur lach midanafshach, then it should have been something that you owned that remained. And Tosas explain, Gabe chocher ikal memer hachi, by a tenant farmer specifically, we can say that as opposed to the owner. Afilu yiftar oso hamachkir militin chakirusa, because even if the owner would say, you don't have to give the amount of produce that you said you were going to give, you can do a deduction here, harei lo nishtayir klum, he's still not going to get anything, because we're talking where the whole field was windswept, and therefore that really wouldn't be something remaining. He wouldn't take a loss, but he would have no gain either, and that's why the owner can make that claim to the tenant farmer. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following Mishnah in Meseches, Erchin, Haisa Shnas Shidafon, V'yerakon, let's say it's a year where the fields are windswept, or it's a year where the fields are affected by mildew, or Shvius, or it's a Shemitah year, the fields are not being worked, or Shahayu Shanim Kishnei Elio, or it's years like the years of Elio and Navi where it didn't rain at all, Eino Ola Lo Min Aminyan, so it doesn't count for the number of years. This is talking about the halacha that if a person sells a stei achuza, a person sells an ancestral field, he's not allowed to redeem it for the first 2 years. And the Mishnah is saying that if in those first 2 years it's a year where it's a years where nothing was growing, those don't count. The person still will have another 2 years. And so the point of the Gemara is, Katani, what does it say in this Mishnah? It says, Shidafon v'yerakon, dumyo deshanim kishnei Elio. We're talking about Shidafon and Yerakon. The fields are windswept, there's mildew, but apparently that's comparable to the years of Elio and Navi. Mashnei Elio de lo havitu aklal. Now, in the years of Elio and Navi, it wasn't simply a regional disaster. There was no produce whatsoever. Afachanami, so too over here also, meaning so too by Shidafon and Yerakon, de lo havitu aklal. Apparently it means there's no produce whatsoever. Avol di'ikotvu, but if there is produce in general, even if there is a regional disaster, salkale, so apparently those years do count in terms of the 2 years. V'lo kwamrin and makas medinahi, we don't say that it's a regional disaster, and therefore the buyer should get additional time. And so the same thing should be true over here. Again, the Gemara is asking by our case, when we're talking about a situation of the tenant farmer deducting, the regional disaster should not be a reason that the tenant farmer is allowed to deduct. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Shani Hasam, it's different over there when we're talking about the ancestral field, Yamar Kra, because there the pasuk says, B'mispar Shnei Tavuos Yimacher Loch, it talks about the years of produce, and therefore we only count those kinds of years. Shanim Sheyesh Bo En Tavua Ba'olam. We're talking about years where there's produce in the world. If there's no produce in the entire world, so then we say the years don't count, otherwise the years count. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Rav Ashi le Rav Kahana. So Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, Ela me'ata, but according to that there has to be no produce in the whole world, so Shvias Tala lo min haminyan. So let's say it's a Shemitah year, that should still count. It's because you do have produce outside of Eretz Yisrael on a Shemitah year. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Lei said to him, Shvias, when it comes to the Shemitah year, Afkata de Malkahi, there the person's not allowed to work the field, and that's a decree from the king, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the Torah, and therefore that situation, it does not count as part of the 2 years. And Rashi explains, Haisa Shnashi Dafan, if it was a year where the fields were windswept, Gabe Mocher Bizman Shayovel Noeg, we're talking about somebody who sells during the times of Yovel, She'eno Mutter Lo Ligol Pachos Mishtei Shanim. Again, the halach is he's not allowed to redeem the field. He can't get it back from the buyer within the first 2 years. He has to wait at least 2 years. Tanan La Be'erchin, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Erchin. And then Rashi says, Afkata de Malka, when it comes to the year of Shemitah, that's Afkata de Malka, which means Hamelech Bitlo Milazora, meaning the king. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you can't plant. V'harei Kemo She'ena, therefore it's considered as if, again, those years don't count at all. V'lo Kara HaKosav L'Yisrael Shnas Tavua, that's not called a Shnas Tavua, it's not called a year of produce. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le Mar Zutra Breider Rav Mori L'Ravina, Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mori, said to Ravina, Ela Me'ata, but according to that the Shemitah year doesn't count because it's Afkata de Malka, and therefore it doesn't count in terms of the first 2 years, that the seller is not allowed to buy it back, so then Shvias Lo Sala Lo Min Hagerua, Shemitah should also not count in terms of the deduction. The way it worked is that at Yovel the field would go back to the seller, and let's say the seller would try to get it back earlier, so he has to pay based on the amount of years until Yovel. And so now the Gemara says, Alama Tanan, why did we learn in the Mishnah, no sein sela upundion lashon? It says that you have to pay 1 sela and a pundion, which is a small amount, a sela and a little bit per every year until Yovel. The idea is that there's 49 years until Yovel, and you have to pay a total. In the very first year, you'd have to pay a total of 50 sela. If you divide that along the 49 years, that's a sela and a pundion per year, and apparently we're counting the Shemitah years in that calculation. And the Gemara says, Amar Le said back to him, Shani Hasam, it's different over there, meaning in a Shemitah year, in terms of the deductions per year, you still can use the field. The Chazia, Lamishtacha Piri, it is fit to use the field. You can still spread produce in the field in a Shemitah year, and so since it's usable in some sense, therefore it does count in terms of the redemption, in terms of the deductions for each year. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, Lo shanu ela shezara v'tzamcha v'yachla chagav. This halacha that you're allowed to deduct by the tenant farmer, that's only true if the tenant farmer planted and it grew and then the locusts came. So then he could say it's a regional disaster, if it is in fact a regional disaster, and he can deduct from what he was going to give. Aval lo zara klal, but let's say he didn't plant at all, so then we don't say that. Yamar le, because he can say to him, Ilu zarata, had you planted, even if there was a regional disaster going on, but the owner can say to the tenant farmer, had you actually planted, have a mekayim be, then the following pasuk would have been fulfilled for me. This is a pasuk from Tehillim, Lo yevoshu be'isra, they won't be shamed in a bad time, uvimei ravon, and in times of famine, yisbo, they will be satisfied. And the Gemara continues, Mesiv Rav Sheshes asks a question from the following Braisa. Roa shahaya roa, let's say a shepherd was taking his herd, v'hiniach edro, but then he leaves his flock, uval and he comes to the city. Ubazei v'taraf, and a wolf comes and tears at the animals. Ubari v'daras, a lion comes and tramples the animals. Ein omrim, we don't say, ilu hayasham, had the shepherd been there, the shepherd is considered like a shomer sachar. We don't say that had he been there, hayamatzel, he would have saved, and therefore he's responsible. Ella, rather, omdeno, so we have to evaluate. Im yochol hatzel, if the shepherd indeed would have been able to save the flock, so chayiv, then he is obligated. V'im lav, and if not, potter, he's potter. And so the Gemara now says, V'yamai, now why do we say that? If we say this pasuk, if we apply this pasuk of lo yevoshu be'esra, we should apply it over here as well. Neimolei, we should say to him, Havis hasam, had you been there, have a mekayim be, this is what the owner can say to the roa, to the shepherd who's a shomer sachar, had you been there, then the following pasuk would have been fulfilled for me. Gam esoari, gam hadov, hiko avdecha, that also the lion and the bear were hit by your servant, meaning to say, you would have been successful because of me against these animals. And the Gemara says to that, Mishum Diyamar Le, because he can say back to him, the shepherd can say back to the owner, Ihavis chazis lisrachushe lochnisa, havis rachish lochnisa Reb Chanina ben Dosa. Had it really been true that you are fit for miracles, a miracle would have happened for you, like Reb Chanina ben Dosa. The Masyan Izi Dovi Bekarnayu, that the goats took the bears in their horns, meaning to say the flocks would have been able to fight off these wild animals, and so therefore clearly you did not merit to have a miracle, so had I been there as well, you can't say that a miracle would have happened. But the Gemara still says, but why can't the owner say to the shepherd, maybe I wasn't fit for a great miracle, but Lanisa Zuta, but for a small miracle, maybe that I was fit for, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kovav Amid Beis.